I'm GW Schulz. This is my illustrious reporting partner, Andrew Becker. We started a Homeland Security project at the center back in about September of 2008. We got some foundation seed money, and the thinking at the time was a lot of newsrooms around the United States had not been able to create a Homeland Security beat. It didn't really fit into traditional beats you saw in newsrooms. You have crime and courts beats, education, public health, even for Midwest papers, they have religion beats. But it was such a new phenomenon, newspapers were still figuring out how to report effectively on this thing, Homeland Security. So there are two areas we knew we really wanted to look at. They were very, very general. Outsized spending on security initiatives after September 11th, and Washington just began pouring money into initiatives, not always knowing if they would work or not, and government surveillance and how it would impact civil liberties in the U.S. So when Janet Napolitano was made Homeland Security Secretary by Barack Obama, from almost minute one, she made Homeland Suspicious Activity Reporting a top priority. So at this point, you can't go to a BART station or an airport or a lot of other major government facilities without seeing the phrase, if you see something, say something. And they've spent a lot of money making sure that few Americans can travel without seeing that phrase. It's a very aggressive promotional campaign. And the idea was to get local police, private security personnel, and ultimately everyday Americans to reporting the activity they thought might have a potential nexus to terrorism. But one of the issues is the types of activities that commonly come up on the list that government officials will identify as suspicious activities are not activities that violate any known rules or laws. It's things like photographing the Golden Gate Bridge, taking notes at the Golden Gate Bridge as if you might be casing the joint. In one case recently I heard about, it was an elderly woman who likes to paint and set up an easel and her painting pad or canvas near chemical manufacturing plants. She likes to paint these facilities, and she had a suspicious activity report generated about her. The Los Angeles Police Department has a list of 60 different activities they consider potentially suspicious that patrol officers are required to note on an incident report if they're reporting to another case, like they show up on a domestic disturbance call and see something inside the home that might indicate to them terrorist attack planning. So that's how things really got started.
In the course of our reporting that had us locally in the Bay Area, Southern California, out to the East Coast, Washington, D.C., police told us over and over again that this isn't really anything new. Police have been picking up tips, leads, and writing them down and sharing them with other police officers and briefings on patrol for centuries. But there is something that's different here, that's new post 9/11. This program that George described began under the Bush administration and has really been expanded by the Obama team. And it's an effort to standardize the suspicious activity reporting when they have a potential nexus to terrorism. And it's essentially an effort to get local police, state police, federal law enforcement, and even all the way up to intelligence officers or the intelligence community to have really kind of a standard language when we're talking about terrorism threats, the idea of connecting the dots. It was a major finding of the 9/11 Commission that law enforcement and the federal government and intelligence did not communicate. State and locals didn't talk to each other. They didn't talk to the feds. The feds didn't talk to the intelligence world, the CIA, because there was a wall there. So the idea was we needed post 9/11 better information sharing. And these programs are the government's avenue to do that. Not only with law enforcement, but as George pointed out, also with private companies, private citizens, and a whole industry is building up around this for intelligence sharing. So there's different, we went to, in one case, San Diego, we went to a conference for law enforcement and information sharing, and there were different vendors that were selling computer programs. So any of you can go for your local police department and log on or access the website, and you saw something weird, your neighbor left their garbage cans out for too long, or whatever it might be, you could put that into the system.
All right, so it's one thing for us to have an interest in this program. It's another thing entirely to figure out how we're going to peel back the curtain from it. That's really the mission of CIR, not just to report that the initiative is growing. It's to figure out how it's playing out on the street. So CIR, for a long time, has used open government laws to try to gain access to government programs and get inside of them in a way that maybe other news organizations haven't been able to. So we really like state open government laws rather than the Freedom of Information Act, because at the federal level you have to deal with a lot of federal bureaucracy and it can take a long time for your FOIA request to get processed. So going to the state level, we approached cities around the country, police departments and fusion centers like the ones described in the animation, and asked them for all communications they'd exchanged with points of interest in that area, major stadiums, theaters, facilities that we knew were being encouraged to report suspicious activity. Now, among open government laws, there typically tend to be provisions that exempt certain types of information from public access. And these laws are set up to make sure that everybody in this room can look at government information about what the government's doing, like government salaries, government contracts, and a lot of that stuff is wide open. But when it comes to law enforcement documentation, like an ongoing homicide investigation, there are provisions that restrict access to that material. And same thing with criminal intelligence. And police were pushing to classify suspicious activity reports as law enforcement intelligence. So in the end, we must have sent out 24 public records requests to cities all over the country trying to get access to these reports. We battled at length with LA because we knew they were generating a lot of these reports, and we lost. With the exception of Minnesota. Minnesota has fairly good open government laws, and they weren't at the point yet with their program where they had managed to restrict well enough public access to suspicious activity reports. So we send a request to police near the Mall of America and the Fusion Center in Minnesota, and we say we want all communications exchanged with the mall. We didn't say the phrase suspicious activity report. I want all emails, I want any piece of paper you've exchanged with them, hoping we would net suspicious activity reports in the process. And that's primarily what we got. A big box shows up at my door in a CD-ROM that totaled, what in the end was like 1,300 pages of material. So we said, okay, if this is what we're going to have to work with, we'll move forward with this. And if we get some additional material around the country, we'll use it. But as far as we were concerned, we now had insight into this program. We had a glimpse inside this program that no one else had.
I just got to reiterate the amount of time and effort that George had put in, really obsessed over. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that George and I just completely nerd out on. I mean, we just are completely obsessed of trying to find the exact right phrase, the right words to crack the code. What are we going to be? How are we going to be able to ask for the right documents that we might not have perfect knowledge? Sometimes we'll check in with sources. They'll say, you need to ask for this, that, or the other. Other times, it literally is, we're on a wild goose chase. We don't know. So he spends hours on the phone basically interviewing the gatekeepers to these records to try to figure out a way of getting these records. So when we've tried door after door after door, and finally there's one that opens, it's fantastic. What we got, those 1,300 pages of documents, were pretty much beyond our wild imagination. It was a journalist's goldmine, because with privacy implications, a lot of times information might be your privacy, or it's law enforcement sensitive. It's heavily redacted. What George got from the Bloomington Police was a trove of records that were almost completely unredacted. So we had names, we had addresses, we had phone numbers, we had social security numbers, all of this data. So we literally could find whoever we wanted to look for, the names of the security guards involved, even police officers. Inside these documents, as you'll see, there were narratives about everything that had happened through the eyes of the security guards. So we had this entire story that we could go back and vet and really fact check and bounce that scenario off of the subjects that were named in these records. It was really quite extraordinary. So with that in hand, we set out to tell a couple of different stories, that looking at the Mall of America as a case study for these expanding programs, looking at domestic intelligence gathering and sharing, and what that looked like, putting a face on these reports. In many cases, for the first time, showing these reports to people who had no idea that they had been written up and that their information may have gone to a fusion center, one of these intelligence hubs. In some cases, they knew very well that the information had at least been shared to the FBI because the FBI had come to their door and asked to interview them. So we set out to tell that story, and that's what we did with National Public Radio and the NewsHour, and that was really a kind of a heartland story. We also wanted to take the story back to Washington, D.C. and look at, and do a Beltway story, and look at the government agency at the Department of Homeland Security that was responsible for connecting these dots and analyzing these, responsible for analyzing these dots in order to connect the dots. And how well were they operating? Still a young office, a young agency, and what were they doing to make America safer, which is the goal of all of this.
They're going to come back. So I'm trying to tell us as a story. And they made it all sound pretty easy, but what they did was remarkable, and it's what journalists do. And when they're talking about the code, they're basically, you're in a sense in a game, maybe not a game, with people who don't want you to get the information. And their job is not to give the public information that the public really has a right frequently to have.